This Sunday, closing arguments.
It's either Donald Trump in there stewing over his enemies list or me working for you, checking off my to-do list.
We're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world.
With just 9 days until Election Day, Vice President Harris and former President Trump make their final appeal to voters.
We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power.
She's not a smart person. She's a low IQ individual. She is. She's a low IQ person.
Plus, general's warning. Donald Trump's former chief of staff, a retired four-star Marine general, warns Trump would govern like a dictator and praised Hitler's generals for loyalty.
It certainly falls into the general definition of fascist.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do.
And 2024 doubts.
Gotta make it too big to rig. Too big to rig, right?
Donald Trump still hasn't conceded the 2020 election. What will that mean for the 2024 results?
Did Donald Trump lose the election? Not by the words that I would use.
My guest this morning, Republican vice presidential nominee Senator JD Vance and Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Joining me for insight and analysis are NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson, Jonathan Martin of Politico, Symone Sanders-Townsend, former chief spokeswoman for Vice President Kamala Harris, and Republican strategist Sara Fagen. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Kristen Welker.
Good Sunday morning. The closest presidential contest in modern history is entering its final stretch. And with just 9 days until Election Day, Vice President Harris and former President Trump are making their closing arguments. Trump focused on a message of fear. Harris casting Trump as a threat to the nation's democracy. In a series of interviews with the New York Times, Mr. Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, retired Marine Corps General John Kelly, warned the former president would rule like a dictator in a second term.
I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
Vice President Harris, joined by high-profile surrogates, including Barack and Michelle Obama, is leaning into a closing argument centered on attacking former President Trump as a danger to the country, an approach campaign officials believe will help her win over the small sliver of undecided voters and motivate her base.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
General John Kelly, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, said that Trump told him he wanted his generals to be like Hitler's generals. In politics, a good rule of thumb is don't say you want to do anything like Hitler.
All of my hope about Kamala is also accompanied by some genuine fear. Fear for our country, fear for our children, fear for what is coming our way if we forget the stakes in this election.
Former President Trump on defense.
It was phony stories by a general that got fired, and he's a whack job, total whack job, a general. It's funny, when you fire people, see, Biden has never fired anybody, but when you fire people for doing a bad job, they get a little bit angry.
The vice president will deliver a closing argument speech on Tuesday at the Ellipse, where former President Trump spoke shortly before the January 6th Capitol attack. NBC News has learned Harris plans to contrast Mr. Trump's worst moment in office and what a second Trump term would look like with what her campaign calls Harris's optimistic vision for the future. On Saturday, former First Lady Michelle Obama appealed to American men. focusing on the issue of reproductive rights.
If we don't get this election right, your wife, your daughter, your mother, we as women will become collateral damage to your rage.
For his part, former President Trump will use a rally tonight at Madison Square Garden to deliver his closing argument.
We'll stop the invasion of criminals into our country, and I will bring back the American dream for your children and for yourself. This is all you need to know. Kamala broke it. I will fix it.
For more on where the race stands and just who the voters are that the campaigns may still be able to persuade, I'm joined by national political correspondent Steve Kornacki. Steve, this race is incredibly tight in the home stretch.
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. One thing we have noticed in the last couple of days, this is not all of the polls that are out there now, but we have seen a number, 4 in the last 4 days, that have shown very small, but in the context of this close race, potentially meaningful movement in Trump's direction. I don't want to overstate it, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore these 4. The CNBC poll came out the other day, has Trump ahead by 2. The Wall Street Journal poll, Trump ahead by 3. These are national numbers. Siena and the New York Times, a tied race. CNN, a tied race. The significance here is broader movement. Again, we're seeing in Trump's direction. To put this in some context, here is our current national polling average. Let me call that up on the screen for you right here. Harris continues to lead nationally. I want to stress that, but we've been tracking this every week on the air here. A couple weeks ago, this number was at 3 for Kamala Harris. Her lead in the poll average now down to 1.2 because of some of the numbers that I just showed you. Of course, the swing states, the battleground states are going to be what decide this election. And look how close those are. We see 1.2 nationally. Just about all these swing states are even tighter than that. So Trump certainly a little improvement nationally, but where the race is decided, absolutely razor thin. But what is happening nationally? Well, we can show you from the CNBC poll. They picked up on something that our own NBC poll was suggesting recently, and that is a shift in the image of Kamala Harris. You can see right now in the CNBC poll, 42 positive, 48 negative, higher negative than positive. That's where Trump is, too, largely, 39, 49. The significance is about a month ago when we were polling this, Harris had a higher positive than negative. In our poll, in the CNBC poll, in other polls out there right now, you see Harris now with that negative going back above that positive rating. That said, tons of uncertainty and volatility remain in this race. Check this out. We can show you this morning also from that CNBC poll, looking at this question of persuadable voters, defining them this way. How about this? 12% in the CNBC poll who currently say they support Harris or Trump say that they could change their mind still in this race. Another 6% say they're undecided or currently going to vote for a third-party candidate. That's a persuadable category of 18%. That's getting close to 1 in 5 voters here. And the uncertainty is particularly acute for Donald Trump. We tell you maybe he's made some gains here, but his support continues to run deepest with voters who it is unclear if they're actually going to turn out and vote. Look at it this way. From our NBC polling, a merge of all of our data, those who voted in the 2020 presidential election and the 2022 midterms, Harris with a 6-point lead, the most reliable block of voters. Those who only voted in the 2020 presidential, that's where Trump opens up a lead. And then those who didn't vote in either, that's where Trump has his biggest advantage over Harris. Are they actually going to vote this time around? Huge question mark. Another way to look at it, we ask folks, scale of 1 to 10, your interest in this election. Again, look at this. Those who rate it the highest, 9 or 10, race is tied, 7 or 8, pretty high, Harris is ahead. Here's where Trump cleans up. Those who say 1 to 6. So again, Trump relying on a coalition that if they turn out could be powerful for him, Kristen, but that's a big if.
Powerful indeed, and those persuadable voters in focus in these final days of the race. Steve Kornacki, great stuff as always. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kristen.
On Saturday, I sat down with Republican vice presidential nominee Senator JD Vance in Erie, Pennsylvania. Senator JD Vance, welcome back to Meet the Press.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. Thank you for sitting down with us. I want to start with some of the news this week. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed that North Korean troops are training in Russia and potentially bound for the war in Ukraine. The U.S. intelligence community confirmed that Russia is creating disinformation to sow doubt in the upcoming presidential election. Let me ask you this question, Senator. Do you see Russian President Vladimir Putin as an ally or an enemy?
Well, I think that he's clearly an adversary. He is a competitor, but I think that we also have to be smart about diplomacy, too. Just because we don't like somebody doesn't mean that we can't occasionally engage in conversations with them. And I think it's important, if we're ever going to end the war in Ukraine, fundamentally at some level, we're going to have to engage in some sort of negotiation between Ukraine, between Russia, between our NATO allies in Europe. And that's just a necessary part. Doesn't mean we have to like it, by the way. Doesn't mean we condone the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think that sometimes you do have to engage in diplomacy, even with and maybe especially with your adversaries. I think the bigger problem, Kristen, if we step back for a little bit, of course, we're on the cusp, obviously, of a presidential election where I want the American people to select my running mate as the next president. Whether it's the cost of groceries, whether it's the southern border, and importantly, whether it's the chaos all over the world, I think really the theme of this election is that Kamala Harris broke things in the world, in the country, and Donald Trump will fix it. And if we get back to his steady leadership, it's not just going to mean lower grocery prices at home, it's also going to mean a much more stable and peaceful world.
When you say that he's an adversary, just to get back to the question, you're not willing to go so far as to call him an enemy.
Well, we're not at a war with him, and I don't want to be in a war with Vladimir Putin's Russia. I think that we should try to pursue avenues of peace. I'd also call China certainly a competitor, but we're not in a war with China either. I do think, though, that China constitutes the biggest threat that we have for the United States of America, and I think that we have to be serious about it. But I think we have to be careful about the language that we use in international diplomacy. We can recognize, obviously, that we have adversarial interests with Russia. We can condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I have, and of course the president has, but we also need to engage in some smart diplomacy if we're ever going to get out of the mess that Kamala Harris has left us in and get back to a posture of peace.
And of course, Donald Trump was president for 4 years while Russia was essentially invading Crimea. Why didn't he kick him out when he had the chance? He had 4 years.
Oh, I think that's a misunderstanding of the history, Kristen. I look at that much differently.
Well, there
First
was
of all,
fighting going on.
We had Russia invade another country, a sovereign nation, during Obama. We had Russia invade a sovereign nation during Bush's term. We had Russia invade a sovereign nation during the leadership of Kamala Harris. The one 4-year term where Russia did not launch a full-scale invasion against a neighbor was under the leadership of Donald Trump. We also have to remember, just on that point, if Donald Trump had not given Ukraine javelins, the country would not exist as an independent sovereign nation anymore. So the idea that Donald Trump wasn't sufficiently strong on Russia, I think, is belied by the actual history of the period.
Again, there was fighting going on for 4 years during Donald Trump.
But there wasn't a full-scale invasion. I think that's important.
Let me ask you, because there are real concerns about Vladimir Putin invading NATO allies. Under a Trump-Vance administration, can you pledge, sitting here today, that the U.S. will continue to remain a member of NATO?
Of course, we're going to honor our NATO commitments, but I think it's important, Kristen, that we recognize that NATO is not just a welfare client. It should be a real alliance. And this is a strong difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants NATO to be strong. He wants us to remain in NATO, but he also wants NATO countries to actually carry their share of the defense burden. Under Kamala Harris's leadership, we've actually seen how weak NATO is as a full-scale military alliance. It's effectively the United Kingdom, a couple of other nations, and the United States. NATO's problem is, particularly Germany, has to spend more on security, has to spend more on defense. We can't be the policeman of the world. We want NATO to be an alliance, not just a dependent of the United States.
NATO has been unified in defending Ukraine. Just to be very clear, though, you would stay in NATO. Just a yes?
We would stay in NATO, Kristen, but this is important. You're right. NATO has done, some of the countries have done a lot, but actually some of the countries relative to GDP have done very little in Ukraine, and that's important. And this, again, we're talking to the American people, of course, and I think a very significant difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is Kamala Harris would like to use our tax dollars and our troops to subsidize Europeans not taking care of their own security. Donald Trump wants Europe to step up big time to become a real ally of the United States and not just a dependent.
Senator, let's move on, because you talked about the threat from China. So this week we learned that China was behind a broad hacking campaign targeting the phones of both presidential campaigns, highlighting the threat that China poses to this country. And yet Donald Trump recently called his domestic political opponents, quote, the enemy from within, and said they are more dangerous than Russia and China. Do you believe that people like Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi are more dangerous than Russia and China?
Well, I think what Donald Trump said is that those folks pose a greater threat to United States' peace and security because America is strong enough to stand up to any foreign adversary.
Do you agree with him? They pose a larger threat to the United States than Russia and China?
What he said, and I do agree with this, what he said is that the biggest threat we have in our country, it's not a foreign adversary because we can handle these guys. We can handle foreign conflicts. We can't handle, look, under Nancy Pelosi's long life in public leadership, the United States has gone from the preeminent industrial power of the world to second next to China. That fundamentally belongs on Nancy Pelosi's shoulders. And if we're going to have a more prosperous country, we've got to recognize our own leadership is why we lost our industrial base to China. Our own leadership is failing to lead this country into peace and prosperity. And of course, Kamala Harris, look, when I look at the biggest threats to America, Kristen, I think the fact that people can't afford groceries, the fact that we can't meet our recruitment goals in the military, the fact that Americans have a wide open southern border, that's a way bigger threat than any foreign threat. And yes, it's caused by broken leadership.
And yet, Senator, as you know, inflation is coming down. Let me ask you about some of what we've heard here.
It's 25% higher, Kristen, than it was when Donald Trump left the Oval Office. Do Americans, and I think this is an important issue.
Ask you about
if
some
Americans
of what we've heard in the US
feel
this week.
like inflation is a solved problem, then maybe they should vote for Kamala Harris. If you feel like the price of groceries, if you feel like the price of housing is too high, if you feel like inflation is not over, then Donald Trump is your man.
Right. There's no doubt folks believe that groceries are too high. Just making the point that inflation has come down.
I agree with those
Let me
folks.
ask you about some of what we've heard here in the U.S. this week. Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, General John Kelly, said Donald Trump is a fascist. He echoed comments made by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who also called him a fascist. When two four-star generals who worked so closely with Donald Trump call him a fascist, why shouldn't voters believe them, Senator?
Well, I think that Mark Milley and John Kelly are both disgruntled former employees, and very many of the things that they accused Donald Trump of, people who were in the room at the time some of those comments were made, they have said explicitly Donald Trump didn't say the things that he was accused of. And look, Donald Trump was already president for 4 years. If he was what John Kelly said he was, then why did Donald Trump deliver peace and prosperity? He didn't arrest his political opponents, as Kamala Harris and her Department of Justice have in fact done.
There's no evidence of that, Senator, that Kamala Harris has arrested their political opponents.
The Department of Justice has not been going after political opponents?
Senator, there's no evidence of that.
The current Department of Justice, under the leadership of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, has absolutely been going after the political opponents of the current Democratic Party. I think that's a disgrace, but it's happening.
There's no evidence that the DOJ is going after their political opponents. Donald Trump was indicted by federal grand juries. Let me ask you, though, you said that they're disgruntled employees. Trump praised both Kelly and Milley. In fact, he said Kelly was, quote, one of the best people I've ever worked with. In addition to those two, Trump's national security advisors, two defense secretaries, even his vice president all say he's unfit to be president. Why should the American people hire Donald Trump when the people who worked most closely with him say that he's unfit to serve?
The people who worked most closely with him, most of them are supporting this ticket. You mentioned one person, two people, a disgruntled ex-employee, Kristen, who Donald Trump fired. He said something nice about him, and then he fired him, and now that person's attacking Donald Trump. But I think this is important because I think the American media has to be honest. Why is it, Kristen, that John Kelly doesn't like Donald Trump? It's not about personality. It's about policy. And I think the American people have the right to know that Donald Trump rejected the John Kelly, the Mark Milley consensus that America should be the policeman of the world. And because of that, these folks hate him. If Donald Trump wanted to start a nuclear war with Russia, I guarantee you that John Kelly and Liz Cheney would be at the front of the line endorsing him. But I think the media misses something really important. This disagreement is not about personalities. This disagreement is because John Kelly didn't like the peace through strength policy of Donald Trump. I do, and I think the American people do.
Chief of staff, and Donald Trump says he only hires the best people. I got to keep moving, though, because our time is very limited. Former Vice President Mike Pence said, quote, President Trump asked me to put him over my oath to the Constitution. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. Will your loyalty, Senator, be to the Constitution or to Donald Trump?
Well, of course, my loyalty is to the American people and to the United States Constitution. But I think the best way to accomplish that loyalty, Kristen, is to get back to a president who delivered the fastest rising take-home pay in a generation, 1.5% inflation, and a secure southern border. I don't think there's inconsistency between loyalty to the Constitution and support for Donald Trump. That's why I'm out there trying to persuade my fellow Americans that Donald Trump's presidency worked for them, and I'd like us to get back to those smart policies.
Just to put a very fine point on this, Mike Pence says Trump asked him to put Trump over the Constitution. If you find yourself in a similar position one day, will your loyalty be to the Constitution or to Donald J. Trump?
I just said my loyalty, Kristen, is to the Constitution of the United States.
Trump?
But have we talked at all about the unaffordable costs of groceries? Have we talked about the fact that because I brought it up, but young Americans can't afford a home? You didn't bring that up. I brought that up. It's so interesting, Kristen, because I think that Kamala Harris's campaign, and unfortunately, too many of her media allies are more interested in what Donald Trump has said than what Donald Trump did in office. You're more interested in what Kamala Harris is accusing Donald Trump of than what Donald Trump actually did during his 4 years in office, which is deliver peace and prosperity.
We're getting a hard wrap. So on the economy, quickly before I let you go, Donald Trump on Friday again floated the idea of getting rid of the federal income tax. Just to be clear, are you proposing eliminating all federal income taxes in a Trump-Vance administration?
Well, Donald Trump didn't propose that. He set that as an aspirational goal.
Is that something you would back,
and what
getting
he
rid
said,
of all federal income taxes?
Well, I'm backing Donald Trump for president, and he set an aspirational goal and said, look, in this country for a long time, we funded the federal government primarily through tariffs. In other words, primarily through penalizing foreign corporations and foreign countries from taking advantage of our domestic markets. That's an aspirational goal. What is very real about what Donald Trump has actually proposed to specific policy proposals is that we want to eliminate taxes on tips. We want to eliminate taxes on overtime pay. That's the Donald Trump policy proposal. He's talking aspirationally about something that he himself thinks is less of a focus than cutting taxes on tips.
Getting a hard wrap, so just yes or no. Is getting rid of all federal income taxes on the table? It's a possibility under a Trump-Vance administration.
Is it on the table with the Democratic Congress that we have? I don't think that's realistic, Kristen. But I do think it's good to set an aspiration of what you want the country to look like.
So you don't rule it out.
And right now we're working on cutting taxes on tips, cutting taxes on overtime.
Okay, so you're not ruling it out. Senator JD Vance.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
And we should note we did extend an invitation to the Democratic vice presidential nominee, Governor Tim Walz. He declined to appear with us this morning. When we come back, Independent Senator Bernie Sanders joins me next. Welcome back. And joining me now is Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Senator Sanders, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you, Senator. Let's start off by talking about Vice President Harris's closing arguments. She is arguing that Donald Trump is a fascist. It does come on the heels of General John Kelly calling her a fascist, Mark Milley calling her a fascist. You just heard me discussing this very matter with Senator JD Vance. Let me put this question to you simply, Senator. Do you believe that Donald Trump is a fascist?
I don't like using those words, but clearly he has a strong tendency to authoritarianism and to undermining American democracy. Look, this is a guy who provoked an insurrection in January 6, 2021, to prevent, and the first time in American history, a peaceful transfer of power. So does Donald Trump believe in democracy, believe in the rule of law? There is a reason, and you raised this a moment ago with Vance, why his own vice president for 4 years, Mike Pence, says he is not supporting Donald Trump. Why Mitt Romney, the 2012 Republican candidate, not supporting Donald Trump. And it's not because of policy issues. It is because they understand that Trump is an authoritarian, does not believe in the rule of law, and for 100 reasons is unfit to be president of the United States.
Senator, given that you think it is too far to label Donald Trump as a fascist, do you think it's a mistake by Vice President Harris to do so?
Well, look, he is an author. Call it what you want. This is a guy who does not believe in democracy, who is trying to divide us up. you can describe him as a fascist. You can describe him as an authoritarian. But to my mind, and what I focus on, is what's happening to the working class in this country. You may recall just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump did his photo opportunity at a McDonald's. All right? He loves McDonald's. Great. But he's asked the question, do you think we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage so that people at McDonald's and millions of other workers don't have to live on starvation wages? He ducked the question. Now, how does it happen that a billionaire cannot support raising the minimum wage from $7.25 to a living wage? Kamala Harris supports raising the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour. I would go higher. But for a billionaire to force people to be working for $9, $10, $11 an hour is absolutely absurd. And if I could add, I'm in Erie, Pennsylvania right now. He was here a few weeks ago. And he gets up there and he does his rally and he meanders. And he says, you know, overtime pay. When I was in private business, I did everything that I could to avoid paying people time and a half overtime. I would hire other workers so I didn't have to pay overtime. And true to his statement, when he was president, he restricted overtime, made it harder for people to get overtime. Harris and President Biden expanded overtime pay. How does it happen? You tell me that a billionaire hanging out with billionaires supported by the richest guy in the world cannot support time and a half overtime for millions of working people.
And really, you're talking about the messaging here, Senator. So let me ask you about that very topic. Vice President Harris started her campaign calling Donald Trump weird, saying she wanted to restore joy to politics. Obviously, a shift now, casting Trump as a real threat to democracy. Do you think that Kamala Harris is giving voters enough reason to vote for her instead of just against Donald Trump?
Well, that's a great question. Look, protecting American democracy ain't nothing more important than that. Protecting a woman's right to control her own body, which Trump opposes, nothing, to me, enormously important. The fact that Donald Trump thinks that climate change is a hoax, in opposition to what every scientist who has studied the issue believes, is also of enormous importance. But if you're asking me, do I think there should be more focus on economics, on the fact that over the last 50 years there's been a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%, to the fact that 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, while the billionaire class has never had it so good, while Donald Trump wants to give even more tax breaks to billionaires. You talked a moment ago with Vance about their idea to eliminate all federal taxes. This would be the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of this country. It would mean the billionaire class, the millionaires, no longer pay a nickel of taxes. But you go to the grocery store, you go and you buy a refrigerator, you're a working class person, prices are going to soar. The idea that you eliminate all taxes, replace them by a tariff, is insane economics. It will hurt desperately poor people and enrich the very rich. And there is a reason why in Trump's campaign, you got 3 billionaires pouring hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that he's elected. They no doubt think it's a great idea that they don't have to pay any more in taxes while we don't raise the minimum wage to a living wage.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question. So now we can move on to my next question, which is about the Middle East. Of course, as you know, as we track the developments in the Middle East, Israel launched retaliatory strikes against Iran on Friday. I spoke with one of the leaders of the Uncommitted National Movement in Michigan. Of course, that's the group that led hundreds of thousands of primary voters to cast ballots against President Biden in the primary, a protest vote for his handling of the war in the Middle East. She told me that she was not voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Take a look. I'll get your reaction on the other side.
Frankly, Vice President Harris' unwillingness to adopt a more humanitarian policy, she hasn't earned my vote. It seems the signal that we've gotten from her and her campaign is that she is willing to risk that of a state like Michigan by continuing to alienate young people, Arab Americans, and Muslim.
Senator, what is your message to this voter, to voters like her? And are you concerned that this issue could cost Kamala Harris Michigan?
Well, Layla, I believe that President Biden in many ways has been the most progressive, pro-worker president since FDR, the only president to ever walk on a picket line to strongly support unions. But I have to tell you, and I've said this a million times, I strongly disagree with their policies on Gaza. Israel, of course, had a right to defend itself against the horrific terrorist attack from the Hamas on October 17th. But they have now gone to war against the entire Palestinian people. 42,000 dead, 100,000 wounded, the destruction of all of Gaza, and now starvation of children. So my own view has been that the United States should not continue to provide financial aid or offensive weapons to Netanyahu's right-wing extremist government. But what I would say to Layla, and to all those people who are thinking of not voting or maybe even voting for Trump, Trump is even worse on this issue. I can tell you we are desperately trying, at the very least, to get humanitarian aid to feed starving children into Gaza. Certainly Kamala Harris and Joe Biden support that. We can't even get Republican support to feed the kids who are in desperate shape. So on that issue, while I disagree with Biden and Harris, they are still better, a lot better than what Trump and Vance are talking about.
Senator, finally, I have to ask you about some developments related to Elon Musk. The Wall Street Journal reporting this week that Musk, who's, of course, a major government contractor, someone who has security clearance that gives him access to highly classified information, has been in regular contact with Vladimir Putin for the past 2 years. My question for you, is it appropriate for Elon Musk, a Trump supporter, to have these secret contacts with Vladimir Putin? And what, if anything, do you think the Biden administration can and should do about it?
No, I don't think it's appropriate. Look, Musk is a very smart, aggressive guy. He is the wealthiest person in the world. And what really interests me is if, God forbid, Trump were to win, whether it would be Elon Musk running the government and Trump working for him, or the other way around. But the idea that you have somebody like Musk who has massive amounts of federal contracts, campaigning hard, putting huge amounts of money into Trump's campaign, man, if there's ever been a conflict of interest, that's it.
All right. Senator Bernie Sanders, thank you so much for your perspective on all of these topics. Really appreciate it. When we come back, with just 9 days to go, the campaigns make their final pitch to voters. Are the strategies working? We'll take a look. The panel's next. Welcome back. The panel is here. NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson, anchor of Sunday Nightly News. Jonathan Martin, politics bureau chief and senior political correspondent for Politico. Symone Sanders-Townsend, former chief spokesperson to Vice President Harris, and Republican strategist Sara Fagen. Thank you all for being here on a very big Sunday. We are 9 days out. Hallie Jackson, you had a chance to sit down with Vice President Kamala Harris this week. It comes as she and Donald Trump are sharpening their closing messages. What did you make of your sit down and what we can expect to see?
Well, let's look at what's happening 48 hours from now. And that is when the vice president is set to deliver that big closing argument speech on the ellipse. And interestingly, in talking with a campaign advisor, they say, listen, it's not going to be all about January 6th. People look at the ellipse and go, OK, that may be the focus. They say that is sort of the stage for a broader speech that looks at Donald Trump, as she has been talking about in recent days, this enemies list versus to-do list. They say that she is going to make the case for her own candidacy, the proactive case of why people, these persuadables that we've been talking about, should sort of cross the bridge and back her instead of former President Trump if they're still on the fence. Former President Trump, interesting to see your interview with JD Vance here, because he tries to pivot, right, to inflation, to the economy, which are the things that the Trump campaign wants the former president to be talking about. His message has been increasingly dark. He's been ratcheting up the rhetoric more and more in these last few days as part of his closing.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, you were just on the campaign trail in Wisconsin and Michigan. How are these closing arguments playing with the voters you were talking to there?
Well, they're resonating with their base, and there's about 3 voters left undecided that are going to decide the fate of the world. Look, I think both candidates are taking risks in the final 2 weeks of the election. We'll start with Kamala Harris. I think she's taking a risk by making this about January 6th and democracy so heavily, because so many of the people who are animated by those issues are already in her column. I'll be curious to see the speech on Tuesday. How much does she pivot to how she would govern, and if she governed from the center? I think Trump's also risking because, Kristen, he is traveling all over the country. It's not just the Garden tonight in New York City. I'm now told he's going to New Mexico New Mexico in the final week of the election. He's also, we know, going to Virginia, and there's talk he even may go to New Hampshire. Guys, those are all blue states and have been for multiple cycles in a row. So he's taking a risk, I think, by leaving the three battleground states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which most folks think are going to decide the election.
Sarah, how fascinating. What do you make of that strategy and the fact that you're frankly seeing both candidates? You saw Vice President Harris in Texas this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at some of the polling out of these states, and while Kamala Harris is comfortably ahead, being up 6 in Virginia, being up 3 or 4 in New Hampshire means he's winning in these other states. I mean, these states move on a continuum. And so I think what he's feeling is confident that he can put her on the defensive in some places. She's going to win, but may not win by as much of a margin as she expects.
Symone.
Well, I just would note I'm interested. I think New York is just as much about making this, play for voters in his home state as it is about the House races as well. And we spoke to Governor Hochul on the weekend earlier today, and she said, well, look, Donald Trump in these House races is not necessarily helpful for Republicans. It reminds them that in these districts where some of them, very purplish type districts, it doesn't help those candidates that are trying to maybe distance themselves a little bit from Trump.
I do think, Sarah, you bring up something interesting, but all of you do. The Trump campaign does seem to feel pretty confident. I mean, they are feeling in the last 9 days, I think, good about where they are, even with the polling showing, and Steve Kornacki laid it out at the top of this show. This is such a close race. And I think the Harris campaign looks at that and they're going, wait a second, it's a little bit of a different electorate in Pennsylvania versus Michigan versus Wisconsin. It's not all the same kind of voter, and they're really trying to sort of hyper-target.
It's a Mars-Venus scenario, the two parties right now. Democrats are filled with anxiety, and the Republicans are cool as cucumbers looking toward Election Day. But it's totally plausible, guys, that we have a much closer popular vote this time around nationally, in which Trump either loses narrowly this time around. But because those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and PA, are so close, that Trump could actually come within 3 in Virginia, 2 in New Hampshire, but still lose the presidency if it does come down to those 3 battleground states on the Great Lakes.
Kristen, can I just make a note about infrastructure? Infrastructure matters here. Campaign
in a close race,
in a close race.
Absolutely.
And the Trump campaign has ceded their infrastructure to Turning Point and Elon Musk, whom neither one of them, in my opinion, have ever, to my knowledge, have won races. And the Kamala Harris Walz campaign infrastructure is one that is deep and well organized.
It is well organized. However, if you look at early vote returns, there is some evidence that Republicans certainly are voting in higher numbers earlier, and his base is voting in higher numbers. And I think that him banking votes now will ultimately make this race incredibly close and potentially put him over the edge.
And, by the way, those early vote numbers in Nevada and North Carolina are ominous for Democrats, and it suggests that her only path may, in fact, be Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania.
It is her path.
Which means that she has almost no margin for error in those 3 states. And issues like the Arab American vote in Michigan become much more central.
You see how narrow when you hear that vote.
We say it internally here, right? The election season, like there's no election day, because millions of people have already voted, right? More than 30 million. What's interesting about the Republican vote, just in talking with experts about this, is number one, it's more in-person than mail-in ballot voting, right? Generally, according to some of the data that we're seeing, which I do wonder is connected to former President Trump being all over the map on this issue of early voting. On the one hand, saying to do it. On the other hand, echoing the election lies he's been telling for years. The other piece of it, there is a question mark. Are these Republicans turning out? Are there more of them, or are they simply just time shifting? Would they have come out on Election Day anyway, and are simply doing it early?
That is always the question, as you analyze these early votes. But banking votes is always better than not banking.
Yeah, and
Symone,
it's
30 seconds
in the
left.
early vote, I feel
What do you make of the early vote? And to the point that Jonathan's making, the Trump campaign does feel emboldened right now. Hallie says this with her reporting, too. What are you hearing from your Democratic sources?
Well, let me just say, I feel like they're going to say they're emboldened either way. They feel emboldened. Donald Trump is laying the groundwork, just as he did in 2020, to say that he won the election when, in fact, he did not. Okay, I think it's very important that we say that. And some of these Republican polls, if you will, that have been out there in the ether, are going to help make that case. I think Democrats are going to run their race. I think it's going to be close. I do think it's going to be very close. And early vote matters, but so does in person.
You set us up for our next panel. Hallie Jackson talked to the Vice President about that. We'll delve into it in our next panel. Stay with us. But when we come back, it's the October surprise Donald Trump's 2016 opponent believes helped derail her campaign. Our Meet the Press Minute is next. Stay with us. Welcome back. 8 years ago today, then FBI Director James Comey met with investigators tied to Hillary Clinton's email case, a meeting that led him to reopen the probe, prompting the biggest October surprise in recent memory. Comey's letter to Congress making the matter public just 11 days before the election sparked outrage from Democrats. Clinton's campaign manager appeared on Meet the Press just a few days later, confident that this bombshell would not cost them at the ballot box.
You believe this could cost you the election?
I don't think so. Look, as I said, we had over 50,000 volunteers out there. We're seeing record early voting numbers in North Carolina, Florida. Look, I would wager in Nevada, turnout is so strong among Democrats there. Hillary could build an insurmountable lead in the coming days in Nevada. We're feeling really good about this record turnout. Over 200 million people now in our country registered to vote. 50 million of those are young people. We're just nose to the grindstone, and we're going to finish this out. But people should not take anything for granted, and we're going to have to work hard to earn this.
Well, former Secretary Clinton would later place some of the blame on Director Comey for costing her the election. When we come back, what happens if the 2024 results are challenged? More with the panel next. Welcome back. The panel is still here. So, Hallie, you sat down with the vice president.
Yeah.
And she told you that she is prepared to act if former President Trump declares victory prematurely. Let's play that, get your reaction on the other side.
I'm very much grounded in the present in terms of the task at hand, and we will deal with election night and the days after as they come, and we have the resources and the expertise and the focus on that as well.
So you have teams ready to go? Is that what you're saying? Are you thinking about that as a possibility?
Of course. This is a person, Donald Trump, who tried to undo a free and fair election.
Hallie, what did you take away from that exchange?
Well, just as far as the question, it's not a hypothetical, right? I mean, the question was framed as this happened last cycle, right? Frankly, we did win the election. Former President Trump came out and declared victory before the votes were counted. And so to that end, is it something? I was curious about what is your campaign doing now? Are you thinking about that in possibility? She very clearly is. NBC News has more reporting that backs up the fact that her campaign has an apparatus in place. You know, if this were to happen, which, again, it does seem that the former president is laying the groundwork for that at this moment here.
Symone.
Yeah, I mean, I remember standing in the boiler room in the 2020 campaign. I was working as an advisor for the Biden campaign, and we watched Donald Trump go to the East Room of the White House and say he had won when he didn't. Now, what happened after that is a week long of briefings, frankly, of the campaign being very clear about what their data is, answering the press's questions. I think that that's something we could potentially see from the Harris campaign going forward if Donald Trump declares victory on Tuesday night.
And viewers should know, again, this is a matter of process. Some of these states, like Pennsylvania, as you know, cannot start counting their ballots until the polls close on election night. So it's not nefarious. It's simply a matter of the state law in these states. So we're probably not, America, going to get the results of this election on election night. And there's nothing to be alarmed about.
Let me show some graphics, and it's such an important point, Jonathan. It's not just the Harris campaign. The public seems to agree. Take a look at these numbers. While over 70% of voters think Vice President Harris will accept the election results if she loses, almost 3/4 of voters believe Trump will not accept the results if he loses. Sarah, what do you make of these figures?
Well, I mean, just based on behavior, you would expect that that poll result. But having said, but like, let's also remember what happened.
Yeah.
You know, he did leave office. He left office when he was supposed to. And as we kind of consider this whole argument about him being a threat to democracy and the Constitution, it's pretty clear to me that he's going to get about 90 million votes, give or take. And they've already concluded that he's not a threat to democracy. I mean, they're voting for him. And it's based on the fact that, you know, the Democrats don't have clean hands on these arguments either. They're talking about undoing the filibuster. They're talking about changing the Supreme Court. So sophisticated.
Let me just say one thing, and then I'm going to toss it to you, Symone. It's important to just point out, you're saying he did leave office, but there was January 6th.
Of course, I'm not defending January 6th.
But I just want to make the point.
But ultimately, people look back at his presidency, and they see that he left office. There was a peaceful transfer of power, and
there was not a peaceful transfer of
listen
power.
to this. And did you watch the inauguration where
I was there?
Well,
Let me just say this. I am very animated by this because on January 6th, I was with the then Vice President-elect of the United States of America at the Democratic National Convention where there were live bombs at the Democratic National Committee, where there were live bombs outside. And the Vice President-elect had to be evacuated. I was there at the inauguration. You know who I saw? I saw Vice President Mike Pence having a moment with then Vice President Harris before he left, but who wasn't there was Donald Trump. So it wasn't a peaceful transfer of power. That's just, we just can't say that.
But Donald Trump's own judicial nominees blocked his attempts to subvert the outcome of the election. So people look at this holistically and they say, I've concluded this isn't a threat and I'm voting for him.
And yet it's that final point that he did. You're acknowledging he did try to overturn the results. Jonathan, that's the fact that is challenging, and that's why you have the Harris campaign preparing for him to potentially declare victory.
But this, I think what we're talking about here goes to the foundation of what the vice president is trying to make in this case. She's out with Liz Cheney. I saw you on the road earlier this week when she was there. Former Congresswoman Cheney is making the case. It doesn't matter about the process stuff if the bottom drops out on the democratic process. The transfer of power was not peaceful. We saw violence before the inauguration 4 years ago, and I think that's where people.
And let's be candid. This should be a good year for the GOP. The only reason that this is a competitive race is that the GOP nominated Donald Trump again. So half the country cannot accept him, in part because he did not accept the results of the last election, no matter their politics. That's why this is competitive at all this year, at a time of really bad inflation and an unpopular incumbent president. So Trump has made this a competitive race. But yes, he still may win because of the underlying factors going on. But let's be serious about what happened in the aftermath of the last election. He refused to concede the election. He sought to overturn the election, and there was a bloody riot on the steps of the Capitol. And so that is deeply sobering, and that's why so many people in this country are dreading the aftermath of this election, because he will never concede no matter the results. And I think it's incumbent upon good folks in your party, Sarah, to stand up and stop that from happening if he does, in fact, lose the election.
That's what happened the last time. And that is what happened the last time.
Yeah.
People in the Republican Party.
But has the party changed since then?
It's important. Is Mike Johnson gonna tell Donald Trump to accept the results of the election? He was a chief cheerleader.
I do think it's important to point out Elon Musk, one of his top supporters, just said last night that January 6th was in no way a violent insurrection. He also claimed that mail-in ballots are a recipe for fraud. So there is a sense of already laying the groundwork for potential discord. All right, we are out of time, guys. Fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. That is all for today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week, because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.